Story number 1.
It was the kind of cold that bit through your jacket no matter how thick it was. I had layered up, thermals, fleece, windbreaker, but the wind still crept in and settled against my spine like ice water. It had rained earlier that morning, so everything in the woods was soaked. The mud sucked at my boots with each step, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. I had been hiking alone in the Shawnee National Forest for 3 days at that point. My plan was to stay out for a full week, testing myself, living off what I packed and whatever I could scavenge or catch. No phone, no GPS. I had a compass, a physical map, and a good knife. That was it. I wasn't new to solo camping. I'd done this several times in different forests, Appalachians, Rockies, even a few trips up in Ontario. But there was something about the Shawnee that I hadn't quite expected. Something old and heavy. The trees felt like they were watching, not in the poetic way people sometimes describe nature, more like suspicious. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. Birds stopped chirping. Even the bugs didn't hum the way they usually do. It was the kind of quiet that amplifies your breathing, your heartbeat, every twig snap beneath your boots. That third night, I pitched my tent just before dusk near a stream. I was careful about my food, hung it from a tree like always, far from the tent. I cooked by the fire, cleaned up everything, and sat back against a log with a small flask of bourbon to take the edge off the cold. The woods around me faded into shadow, and my fire flickered like a heartbeat. I didn't hear any animals, no rustling of raccoons, no howling in the distance. Nothing. Just silence, except for the stream gurgling a few yards away. It was around midnight when I woke up. Something had snapped me out of sleep, though I wasn't sure what. I laid there in my sleeping bag, eyes open in the dark, listening. The fire had gone out and the woods were pitch black, no moonlight, no stars, just a black void outside my tent walls. Then I heard it. A shuffle, slow, heavy, like something dragging its feet through the wet leaves. It wasn't close, maybe 30 or 40 feet off, but it was moving. Not in a straight line. It would take a few steps, then stop. Then a few more, closer this time. Then silence. It didn't sound like a deer or a raccoon. Too slow. Too methodical. And I swear there was a sound, barely audible, like breathing. Labored, slow, raspy breathing. I held my breath and waited. The sound came again, now maybe 20 feet away, but still out of sight. My first instinct was to reach for my knife, which I kept tucked into my boot at night. I moved slowly, silently. But as I was reaching, the dragging footsteps suddenly stopped. Dead silence. No breathing. I waited 1 minute, 2, then 5. Nothing. Just the low gurgle of the stream. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a deer with an injury, or maybe a black bear wandering past. I didn't unzip the tent to check. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. Morning came slow. The overcast sky made it hard to tell how long I had been laying there with my eyes open. When I finally crawled out of the tent, the woods looked the same as always. Wet, brown, leafy. But there were footprints in the mud about 15 feet from my tent. Human. Bare feet. No shoes, no socks. Just 2 sets of long, narrow footprints, the toes oddly spaced. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the thick undergrowth beyond the stream. They didn't come from anywhere that made sense. No trail. No signs of someone camping nearby. I didn't pack up. Not immediately. I sat there for maybe 30 minutes trying to convince myself someone else was just screwing with me. Maybe another camper wandered too far and got lost. But I hadn't seen anyone for days, and this part of the forest wasn't popular. No trail markers for miles. I had bushwhacked to get here. Even experienced hikers would avoid this section. Eventually, I packed up and started walking. I wanted to go deeper, push toward the east ridge where the terrain got rocky and open. I figured if someone was out here, I'd spot them from the higher ground. It was another 4 miles before I made camp again, this time on a ridge overlooking a small clearing. I picked the spot specifically because it gave me a good view in all directions. I wanted to see someone coming, if it came to that. The day passed uneventfully. No footprints, no sounds, just wind and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I didn't build a fire that night, just ate some jerky, drank water, and zipped into the tent early. I kept the knife in my hand as I lay down, staring at the roof of the tent. That's when I heard the voice. It wasn't loud, barely a whisper, but it was right outside the tent. Help, a woman's voice. Weak, hoarse. Just one word. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I waited to hear it again, thinking maybe I imagined it. Help me. Still a whisper. Still that same broken, pitiful tone. I slid my hand down and gripped the zipper of the tent, but I didn't open it. Something about the voice felt wrong, too controlled, like someone pretending to be weak, like bait. I sat there, listening, for 10 minutes, nothing else. Then I heard the crunch of leaves, again, dragging footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I lay there in silence for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, but even when I drifted off, I never slept deeply. Every few minutes, I'd jolt awake, certain I heard something moving nearby. By the time dawn broke, I was already packed. I didn't even eat, just got moving. I hiked the entire next day without stopping more than a few minutes. I thought I'd feel better once I got to familiar ground, an old ranger trail I knew that eventually led to a dirt access road. But even when I found it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I found a small lean-to shelter used by rangers during controlled burns. It was old and half-collapsed, but it had a roof and 3 walls, so I decided to sleep there instead of pitching my tent. I figured maybe being off the ground would help me feel safer. It didn't. At some point in the night, I heard scratching. Not the kind animals make when they dig or paw around. This was rhythmic, controlled, like someone running their fingernails along wood. It came from behind the wall I was leaning against. I sat bolt upright and pressed my ear to the boards. The scratching stopped, then came a thump, soft, like something tapping wood. I waited. Silence. Then came the voice again, closer this time. Please, help me. It was right behind the wall. I jumped out of the lean-to and ran into the woods with just my headlamp and my knife. I didn't stop until my legs gave out, and even then I crawled behind a thick fallen log and stayed there the rest of the night, clutching the knife until my fingers cramped. When morning came, I stumbled back to the trail and followed it to the road. It took me until mid-afternoon before I saw signs of people again. A camper van parked near a trailhead, and a couple who looked startled when I burst out of the woods like a madman. They offered me water, food, even a ride back to the ranger station. I accepted. I didn't tell them what I heard, just said I thought I saw a bear and got lost for a couple nights. I filed a report with the rangers just in case someone else heard the voice or saw the footprints. They nodded politely, but I could tell they didn't believe a word. One of them told me people often hear weird things in the forest at night. Echoes, hallucinations, maybe even feral people. But she said it with that same forced calm that doctors use when they tell you your symptoms are probably nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't go back. Weeks later, I looked up reports of missing persons in that part of the forest. There were several: hikers, campers, even a hunter. One case from 3 years ago involved a woman who went missing near a stream not far from where I'd camped on my 3rd night. The report said she called 911 and whispered for help before the call cut off. They never found her. I don't know what I heard. I don't want to know. But I do know this. I'll never hike alone again. And I'll never forget the way that voice sounded just inches from my tent wall. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I don't know exactly how to explain what happened without sounding like I'm making it up, but I'll try. This happened in the fall of 2019, a few months before everything shut down due to COVID. I was in between jobs, living off the last of my savings, and trying to work out what to do next. My girlfriend had just broken up with me, and I needed to clear my head. So I went out into the woods for a solo camping trip. I'd done it before, twice actually, and I liked the feeling of being cut off from the world, even for just a few days. The area I went to was in northern Maine, near Baxter State Park. Not inside the park itself, but a little northwest of it. There's a huge stretch of forested land that's technically public but rarely visited. You can hike for hours without seeing a single soul. It's beautiful, silent, untouched. The kind of silence that feels heavy. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road that had been barely drivable. From there, I hiked a good 8 or 9 miles into the woods with my pack. Tent, stove, dried food, water, map, compass, flashlight, the usual. I wasn't totally roughing it, but I also didn't bring anything like GPS or a phone. I wanted to be truly off-grid for at least 4 days. Dumb in hindsight, maybe, but that was the idea. The first day and night were uneventful. I set up camp near a small stream, made some food, read for a while, and slept pretty well. There was the usual animal noise: crickets, owls, maybe the distant snap of a branch. It's funny how the forest never really feels quiet, even when there's no one around. The weirdness started the second night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. Not like a raccoon or a squirrel. It was slower, heavier. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer. Then it paused, and I swear I heard what sounded like breathing. Slow, raspy, almost labored breathing. I sat up and listened. The breathing got closer, then stopped just outside the tent. I didn't move. I held my breath and waited, trying to hear more. But everything went still again. No wind, no animals, nothing. I waited for probably 10 full minutes, absolutely still. Then I heard the softest crunch of leaves moving away deeper into the woods. Whatever it was, it didn't run. It just walked away. In the morning, I found no tracks. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so it wouldn't have been easy to spot anything. But I didn't see or hear anything else out of the ordinary. I convinced myself it really had been a deer, and my imagination did the rest. I tried to shake it off, but I packed up and moved my camp a bit farther down the stream anyway, maybe another mile. That day, I kept thinking I was being watched. Every time I stopped walking or looked up from what I was doing, I had that prickle on the back of my neck. The rational part of me knew it was probably just nerves or leftover fear from the night before. But it didn't go away. I started catching movement out of the corner of my eye, always just beyond the trees. When I turned to look, there was nothing, but the feeling remained. That night, I built a fire and kept it going longer than usual. I cooked and sat close to it, like feeling exposed. The woods felt wrong. Not in any visual way, they looked the same, but the air felt dense, too quiet again. No animals, no insects, just me and the fire. At around midnight, I heard the breathing again. This time it came from the left side of the tent, closer than before. I froze again, listening. I didn't have a weapon beyond a small camping knife, and I wasn't about to unzip the tent and check. But then it did something I can't explain. It started mimicking me. That's the only way I can put it. I'd coughed maybe 20 minutes before, and now outside the tent I heard the same exact cough. Not similar. Exact, like someone had recorded it and played it back. Then a pause. Then the sound of me zipping the tent flap. Again, exactly as I'd done it earlier that night. I whispered, "Who's out there?" Nothing. I said it louder. "Hello?" Still nothing. Just the sound of something shifting its weight outside. Then silence. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I fell asleep. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to do anything else. In the morning, I found footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet, human, adult-sized, but the toes were oddly long, and the impressions were deep, like whoever made them weighed a lot or pressed down harder than normal. I followed them for about 50 feet before they just vanished. Not faded, vanished. They stopped in the middle of a clearing. No return path, no sideways detour. Just stopped. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I packed everything quickly, faster than I ever had before. I started heading back toward where I'd parked my car. I hadn't planned on hiking the full 8 miles back in one day, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The strange thing was, the deeper I got back toward where I'd come from, the more disoriented I felt. I had my compass, and it was working fine. But the trails didn't look the same. Trees that I swore I hadn't passed before seemed familiar. A tree with a broken branch. Distinctive, right? I saw it 3 different times over the course of 2 hours, each time from a different direction. I wasn't lost. I followed the stream, and the compass said I was going the right way. But it felt like something was shifting the forest around me, as if it didn't want me to leave. It got worse. Around midday, I stopped to rest and drink some water. That's when I saw something carved into a nearby tree. It was my name, just my first name, Dan, carved in deep, jagged letters. The bark around it looked freshly torn, like it hadn't been there more than a day. I hadn't carved it. I hadn't passed this tree before. I would have remembered. And yet, there it was. My name, like something had been following me. The last few miles to the car were a blur of panic and fast hiking. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I heard noises behind me, twigs snapping, what sounded like whispers, even faint laughter, but I kept going. When I finally saw my car, I almost cried. I ran the last few steps and practically threw my gear into the trunk. As I got in and started the engine, I glanced up at the edge of the woods. Something was standing there, just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin, pale. I couldn't see a face, but it was watching me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I drove off without looking back. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares. Always the same, something watching me from the woods, breathing just outside my vision, and always the sound of my own voice repeating things I'd said during the trip. Like it had memorized me. A month later, I had the urge to go back. Not to camp, but just to see if the place was real, to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. I resisted it, thankfully. Something about the whole experience felt like a lure, like it wanted me to return. I never did. I've told a few friends about it, but they either laugh it off or assume I was tired, hallucinating, maybe had bad food. But I wasn't. I know what I felt, I know what I saw, and I'll never go camping alone again. Whatever is out there, it's old. It knows how to copy us, how to mimic, how to confuse, and it doesn't like being seen. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It started out as a simple weekend getaway. I needed a break. Work had been relentless, and I hadn't had any real peace in months. My friend Nick had told me about this place upstate New York, a cabin deep in the woods, not listed online, just something passed down in his family. It sounded perfect. Isolated, quiet, peaceful. No reception, no internet, no distractions. That's all I wanted. Just me, a few books, and some time to think. Nick warned me the roads were rough, and he wasn't exaggerating. The dirt path that snaked into the woods was more like an overgrown trail than a road. My SUV bumped along the uneven terrain, branches scraping the sides like claws, until finally the trees opened up and the cabin came into view. It was modest, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch and weathered wooden siding. The clearing around it was just wide enough to let some light in during the day, but even then, the tall pines and dense underbrush seemed to crowd around, trying to reclaim it. I arrived around 4 p.m., enough daylight left to get settled. I unloaded my cooler, backpack, and a duffel bag. There was no electricity, but the propane stove worked, and the small fireplace looked ready to use. A hand pump well out back gave cold but clean water. Inside smelled faintly of wood and earth, and the single bedroom had a creaky old bed with clean sheets Nick's uncle had left behind on his last visit. I lit a few candles, unpacked a book, and sat on the porch with a beer as the sun dipped below the trees. I should have paid more attention to how quiet it was. The first night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirp of crickets, the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush, were oddly comforting. I cooked a can of soup, read a few chapters, and went to bed early. The wind rustled the trees outside, and though the creaking of the cabin made it hard to sleep at first, I eventually dozed off. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up the first time. I didn't know why at first. No loud noise, no dreams, just awake. I lay there listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Then I heard it. Crunch. Just one footstep. Slow. Deliberate. Leaves and twigs cracking beneath weight. I sat up in bed, heart racing. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but something about the way it stepped didn't sit right. It wasn't hurried. It was careful. Measured. I waited. Nothing else. I got up and peered out the window. The trees were dark, their shadows swallowing any detail beyond the porch. I could see the clearing, but barely. I didn't see anything. I tried to laugh it off, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Light filtered through the trees, birds were back to chirping, and the forest was alive again. I brushed it off as nerves. Maybe I'd imagined the sound. That afternoon, I went for a hike. I followed a narrow trail from the back of the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The deeper I went, the less I heard. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own footsteps. About a mile in, I found something strange. It was a small clearing, maybe 20 feet wide, and in the center was a dead tree, blackened, like it had been struck by lightning, but there was no burn smell, and the rest of the forest looked untouched. Around the tree, evenly spaced, were several animal bones. Some still had bits of fur or tendon attached. They looked fresh, too fresh. I didn't stay long. Back at the cabin, I felt uneasy. I couldn't explain it, but it was like something was watching. I turned my head quickly tonight, thinking I saw something just out of the corner of my eye. Shadows moved wrong. Sounds echoed strangely. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time there were more of them, not just one, two, maybe three. Crunch. Pause. Then another. They circled the cabin slowly. I could hear them moving just outside, their movements deliberate, not animals. No panting, no rustling, just footsteps, slow and heavy. I didn't have a gun, but I did have a camping axe. I stayed in the dark, clutching it tightly, listening. At one point, something brushed against the side of the cabin. Not hard, more like a hand dragging along the wood. And then the footsteps stopped. I waited, heart pounding, every muscle tense. Eventually, the faint sounds of the forest returned, and by morning it was like nothing had happened. I checked outside, no footprints, no signs of anything, but there were 3 deep gouges in the porch railing, clawed, not cut. I tried to take a photo, but my phone was dead. I knew it was fully charged before I left. I decided to leave the next morning. But that night was worse. It started earlier, just after dusk. I had locked all the doors and windows. I piled furniture against the door. I didn't care how crazy it seemed. I wasn't taking any chances. I kept the axe in my lap and sat on the floor in the main room, facing the door. The footsteps came again, louder this time, heavier. Like whatever was out there didn't care if I heard it now. Something started tapping on the windows, not scratching, tapping, like a fingernail. Each window, one by one. Then I heard whispering. I don't know how else to describe it. Low, guttural whispers. Not in English, not in any language I knew. It came from all around the cabin. First one voice, then another joined in. Sometimes they stopped for a while, then started again, closer. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. I sat there, paralyzed, as something began knocking on the front door. 3 slow knocks. I didn't answer. I didn't speak. I just stared at the door, waiting. Then the whispering stopped. I heard the front doorknob turn. The deadbolt held, but it twisted again and again. And then the laughter started. It wasn't loud. It was soft, childlike, like someone giggling just beyond the wood. But it was wrong. Too slow, too hollow. Then something slammed against the back of the cabin. The whole place shook. Then again, louder. I was sure it would break through. And then silence. I didn't move for hours. Not until the first light of dawn filtered through the window. I ran outside, barely grabbing my bag. I didn't stop to check for damage or footprints or anything. I just ran to the car, heart pounding. I slammed the door and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I screamed, hit the wheel, and tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood and looked inside. Every wire had been cut. Clean. Straight across. That's when I saw it. On the windshield. A handprint. Not in dirt. Not in condensation. A greasy, black handprint. Thin fingers. Too long. I didn't go back to the cabin. I took off down the trail on foot, praying I could find the main road. I didn't care how long it took. I walked for what felt like hours, constantly looking over my shoulder. At one point, I swear I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't turn around. I just kept going. Eventually, I made it to a ranger station. I must have looked like hell, sweaty, dirty, eyes wild. I told them my car broke down, left out the rest. They gave me a ride to the nearest town. I never looked back. A few weeks later, Nick called. He sounded nervous. "Hey," he said, "weird question. Did you carve anything into the porch at the cabin?" "No," I said. "Why?" He paused. "My uncle went up there this weekend, said there were symbols burned into the wood, like some kind of language." I didn't say anything. Nick continued. "He won't go back. Said it felt evil, like something was watching him." I never told him what happened. I've tried to forget. I don't go near the woods anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike. Sometimes when it's late and the wind stops and the world goes quiet, I think I hear it again, that slow, measured crunch of footsteps in the dark. And once, just once, I found a long, greasy handprint on my bedroom window. 2nd floor. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves as I set off along the winding trail that morning. The forest around me felt ancient. Tall, gnarled trees twisting upward, their branches weaving together in a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was early autumn, and the ground was blanketed with fallen leaves in hues of red, orange, and yellow. The occasional rustle from small animals scurrying through the underbrush was the only sound, besides the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I had taken time off work to go on a solo hiking trip. I needed the solitude. I needed to get away from the pressures of daily life, The noise, the constant ping of notifications, the demands. Just me, the trees, and the winding trail that seemed to stretch on endlessly. I had prepared for the trip for weeks, researching the area and planning each step. The trail I had chosen was not heavily trafficked, and it was known for its beauty, offering sweeping views and untouched nature. The plan was simple: hike for 4 days and 3 nights, camping by the streams, cooking my meals, and enjoying the peace. I'd camped in the woods many times before, but there was something different about this trip. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean closer as I hiked deeper into the forest, their thick trunks blotting out the sky. Or perhaps it was the stillness that surrounded me, this suffocating quiet that seemed to press in on my senses, making everything seem just a little too sharp, a little too perfect. It wasn't long before I started feeling a creeping sense of unease, but I brushed it off. After all, I had prepared well. I wasn't afraid of the woods. The first 2 days went smoothly. I reached the first campsite, a small clearing by a bubbling stream, and set up my tent. I enjoyed the evening, sitting by the fire, watching the flickering flames cast long shadows across the trees. The night was calm, with only the occasional hoot of an owl to break the silence. But on the third night, everything changed. I had ventured farther into the woods, into a part of the forest I had not explored before. I had heard whispers about it, about strange occurrences, but I didn't think much of it. After all, stories about the woods were always exaggerated, weren't they? Everyone had a story about a friend of a friend who had gone missing or heard something they couldn't explain. But that night, as I sat by the fire, something felt wrong. The woods felt different, more alive somehow. The trees seemed to sway in the wind, their branches moving unnaturally as though they were trying to communicate with each other. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire, and even that felt hollow. The night air was thick and oppressive, and it seemed to press against my chest with every breath I took. I tried to shake off the feeling. I made my dinner, ate, and then decided to get some rest. But as I lay in my tent, the sound of the forest outside seemed to change. It wasn't the usual chorus of nocturnal animals that I had grown accustomed to on previous nights. There were no night birds calling, no rustling of leaves from small animals. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. I listened for a long time, straining my ears, but there was nothing, just complete suffocating silence. Then came the first sound, a faint thud, far off in the distance. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I listened carefully. Another thud, followed by a low groan that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The sounds were unsettling, unnatural. But still, I told myself it was just animals. Maybe a bear or something else large moving through the forest. Bears didn't bother people unless provoked, right? I tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer. The thuds came more frequently, followed by strange rustling, like something moving through the underbrush, something large and deliberate. And then it came, a whisper. It was so soft that I almost missed it, but there was no mistaking it. A voice, low and almost melodic, drifting through the air outside my tent. Help, I froze. The voice was unmistakably human, and it sounded so close, too close. I held my breath, hoping I had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time and more urgent. Help me. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart racing, every nerve on edge. My first instinct was to unzip the tent and see what was happening, but then I remembered that the forest could play tricks on your mind. There was no way anyone could be out there this deep in the woods at this hour. It didn't make sense. I glanced around my tent, trying to calm myself, but that feeling, the one I couldn't shake, was still there. Something wasn't right. Another whisper, this time just outside the tent. Please, help me. My hands trembled as I reached for the knife I kept in the pocket of my backpack. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe a bear, maybe some lost hiker. But whatever it was, I needed to be prepared. My mind raced through scenarios, each one more absurd than the last. Maybe someone was lost, maybe they had been injured, but who would be this far into the woods at night? I held my breath, waiting for the next sound. And then it came. A heavy thud, followed by slow, dragging footsteps. The kind of movement that was far too heavy to be a person. The sound was slow, deliberate, and it circled my tent, coming closer with each passing second. I pressed myself against the back wall of the tent, willing myself to stay quiet. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? Should I run? Should I leave the tent and face whatever it was that was out there? The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Then I heard something worse than the footsteps. A scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. A slow, methodical dragging. Closer, closer. My breath caught in my throat as I heard the noise move right up to the side of the tent. I could feel the weight of whatever it was just outside, the air thickening with tension. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. No noise, no movement. Just the eerie quiet of the forest. I lay there, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of it all. Was it just an animal? Was I imagining it? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to find out. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to sleep, too terrified to even move. At first light, I quickly packed up my tent, my hands shaking as I folded it up. I didn't want to stay in that spot for another minute. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the woods as fast as I could. I left the campsite in a rush, my footsteps quick and erratic as I retraced my path back to the trail. The feeling of being watched never left me as I hiked out of the woods. It was as if something was trailing just behind me, keeping pace, always just out of sight. My legs burned, my mind raced, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. When I finally reached the parking lot, I didn't look back. I threw my gear into the car, slammed the door shut, and drove without stopping. It wasn't until I was 100 miles away that I could finally breathe again, my mind struggling to make sense of the night. And though I tried to push it out of my mind, the memory of that whisper stayed with me, haunting me. That voice, calling out in the darkness. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful trip. Just me, my backpack, and the dense forest of the Adirondacks. I had been planning the solo hiking and camping trip for months. I had all the right gear: tent, sleeping bag, enough food, and a solid map of the area. I'd been camping alone before, and the woods always felt like home to me. The peace, the stillness, the vastness of it all. It was where I could escape from the noise of everyday life. But this time, something was different. Something I didn't understand, and I still don't. I set out early in the morning, hoping to reach a secluded spot by nightfall. The trail was one I'd researched, a place that wasn't on the major tourist routes, but not so obscure that I'd get lost immediately. I'd seen it marked on several old hiking maps as a perfect spot for solitude. The first few hours were beautiful: cool air, sunlight filtering through the canopy of trees, birds singing overhead. It was the kind of day that makes you feel like nothing could go wrong. I made good time. The forest was dense, but the trail was clear, winding gently through groves of pines and hardwoods. I didn't pass another soul, which was exactly what I wanted. I stopped a few times to rest, take in the scenery, and drink from the canteen I carried in my pack. By mid-afternoon, I had covered a good 10 miles, and the sun was starting to dip lower. It was the perfect time to find a place to camp, so I pulled off the trail and wandered a little deeper into the woods to find a good spot. The site I chose was on a small rise near a stream that trickled over rocks. There was a slight breeze, and the trees created a thick, comforting canopy. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, gathered some wood for a fire. As the sun began to set, I built a small campfire, its crackling flames filling the quiet air. It was serene, perfect. I cooked my dinner, a simple freeze-dried meal, and sat back to eat while I watched the sky darken. That's when I first heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustling in the underbrush. I assumed it was a small animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then it came again, closer this time. The sound of footsteps in the leaves, the dry crunch of twigs snapping. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively reached for the knife I kept by my side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking just a little. There was no answer. I stood up, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam of light only cut through the darkness for a few feet before disappearing into the dense trees. I stood there for a long moment, listening, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds of breathing, just the wind rustling through the branches. I told myself it was probably nothing. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear. It wasn't unusual to hear animals moving around at night. I returned to the campfire and tried to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. It was hard to relax, though. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made my heart race. I kept the fire going, adding more wood, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. But as the night wore on, the noises didn't stop. It wasn't just the usual nighttime forest sounds, it was the way they seemed to follow me. The way the footsteps were almost deliberate, as if something or someone was circling my camp. It wasn't just the random sounds of animals. No, this felt different. I lay awake for hours in my tent, the shadows outside stretching as the fire flickered. The air felt too still, too thick. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that the quiet of the forest was just playing tricks on me, but my instincts told me something was wrong. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, the fire was low and the moon had risen high in the sky. The rustling outside had stopped, but something still felt off. I poked the fire with a stick, making the embers flare up. I glanced around, scanning the perimeter of the campsite, but saw nothing. Still, that feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I tried to convince myself that I was just being overly cautious, but then it happened again. A faint noise in the distance, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Only this time, it wasn't from the woods behind me. It was from the direction of the trail, the path I had walked earlier in the day. Someone was out there. Someone was coming toward me. My heart began to pound in my chest. I grabbed the knife from my side and stood up, my eyes wide and darting around in the dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the footsteps getting closer. Slow, deliberate, the crunch of each step more distinct. I called out again, my voice shaky this time. "Hello, is someone there?" No response, just more footsteps. Closer now. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam shone only a few feet in front of me. The trees were thick, blocking out the light beyond the small area surrounding my camp. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them. I could feel their presence. I stood frozen, listening, my breath shallow. The footsteps were now just a few yards away. I could almost hear the rustle of clothing, the heavy breathing of whoever or whatever was out there. The silence between each step was deafening. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I stood there, heart racing for what felt like an eternity. But there was no sound, no movement, nothing. Eventually, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my pack and rushed out of the tent, running blindly into the woods. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from whatever was out there. The flashlight bounced in my hand, illuminating only the trees around me. The sound of my feet pounding the ground was the only noise in the night. But as I ran, I thought I heard something else. A whisper. Just faint, but it was there. My name. It sounded like my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one else out there. No one. The whisper came again, louder this time. Leave. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't a voice at all, really. It was more of a thought, a command that came from the darkness itself. I felt a cold chill run through me as I stood there, frozen in fear. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a random encounter. This wasn't just an animal or another hiker. This was something else. I backed away slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. I didn't look behind me. I didn't dare. I just kept moving, pushing through the underbrush until I stumbled onto the trail again. I don't remember much after that. I remember running, my legs burning, my lungs gasping for air, as I made my way back to the parking area where I had left my car. The whole time, I felt that presence behind me, following me through the trees, always just out of sight. When I finally reached my car, I didn't look back. I didn't care. I just got in, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by the noise of traffic and the bustle of people. The feeling of being followed never left, though. Even now, months later, I can't shake the sensation that something is still out there, waiting, watching. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
I had always been the type of person who sought out solitude. The hustle and bustle of city life never appealed to me, and after years of living in a concrete jungle, I decided to take a break from it all. A solo hiking and camping trip seemed like the perfect way to reconnect with nature and clear my mind. So I packed my bag, left my apartment behind, and set off into the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest. The hike started off as it always does, peaceful, calm, and full of the serene sounds of nature. The trail was well worn, a path familiar to seasoned hikers, but one that still gave the feeling of being far from the reach of civilization. My plan was simple: hike for a few days, set up camp in a secluded area, and enjoy the peace and quiet. I didn't plan on encountering anything out of the ordinary. Just me, the woods, and the occasional bird or squirrel. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller, their thick branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The path became narrower, and I found myself surrounded by nothing but nature. No sounds of traffic, no human voices, just the wind rustling through the trees. It was the kind of silence that felt suffocating and comforting at the same time. I loved it. The first day of the hike was uneventful. I walked for hours, stopping only to eat, drink, and rest for a bit. By the time the sun started setting, I found a small clearing beside a creek and set up camp. The firewood was abundant and the air was cool but not cold. It was a perfect night to be alone in the woods. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, eating freeze-dried food and watching the flames flicker and dance. There was something about the isolation that felt reassuring, like the world had stopped and I was the only one left. It was a welcome break from the constant noise of my life. As the night grew darker, I retired to my tent and fell asleep to the sound of the creek running nearby. It was around midnight when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why I had stirred. Maybe it was a noise, or maybe it was just the eerie stillness of the forest at night. I lay still in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to catch any sound. There was nothing. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just the faint sound of the creek in the distance. But then, I heard it. A faint sound, something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something moving through the brush. But the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the soft patter of paws or the rustling of leaves as an animal scurried by. It was a distinct, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Human footsteps. I froze. My heart began to race. I had seen no one on the trail all day, and I was miles away from the nearest road. The idea of someone else being out here, especially this late at night, made my skin crawl. I lay in my tent, listening as the footsteps grew louder. They were slow, heavy, like someone was walking deliberately toward my camp. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. The forest around me was silent once again. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination. But then I heard it again. A whisper, just barely audible, but unmistakable. "Hello?" My blood ran cold. The voice was low, gruff, and not at all friendly. It didn't sound like someone lost or in need of help. It sounded like someone was watching me, waiting. I didn't know what to do. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone. I could feel my body tensing up, a primal fear settling deep in my bones. The voice came again, closer this time. "Are you there?" I held my breath, praying that whoever it was would just leave. Maybe they were just another hiker who had lost their way. But that voice didn't sound lost. It sounded like a predator, like something was playing with me. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. My thoughts were racing, and my mind was filled with dark possibilities. What if it wasn't a person at all? What if it was something else, something far worse than a lonely hiker? Then, as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps began to move away. The sound of them receding into the night filled me with a strange mix of relief and dread. I waited a few moments, and when I felt certain that whoever, or whatever it was, had gone, I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The fire was just a pile of embers now, the heat long gone. Everything seemed normal, but there was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that I was not alone. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shined it around the campsite. There was nothing. No signs of anyone having been there, no footprints in the dirt, nothing. But the feeling of being watched never left. I spent the rest of the night in my tent, my nerves on edge. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach and listened for any sounds outside, but there were no more footsteps, no more whispers. The woods had fallen back into their usual nighttime rhythm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I was determined to put the events of the previous night behind me. I packed up my camp, ate a quick breakfast, and set off down the trail. The woods were quiet again, the only sound being the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the birds singing their morning songs, but my mind kept drifting back to what had happened. Who had been out there? Why had they been watching me? And more importantly, why had they left without a word? As I hiked, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was the nagging feeling that I wasn't the only one on the trail, that something was following me, something I couldn't see. By late afternoon, I found a small stream and decided to stop and rest. I refilled my water bottle and sat down on a rock to catch my breath. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just behind me. I stood up quickly, spinning around to face whatever was there. But there was nothing. The forest was empty. The sound had stopped. I walked to the edge of the stream, my pulse racing. I scanned the trees, the bushes, the ground. There were no signs of anyone, just the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. But then I saw it. A footprint. A large, deep impression in the mud next to the water. It was fresh, still damp from the night's rain. I knelt down, examining it. The shape was wrong. It wasn't the print of a normal boot or shoe. The edges were too jagged, too uneven. It looked almost unnatural. I felt my stomach drop. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it possible? Could it be? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about the distance. I just ran, heart pounding in my chest, pushing myself through the woods. I could hear the footsteps behind me again, slow and steady, like they were right there, just out of sight. I didn't dare look back. It wasn't until I reached my car that I finally stopped. I was out of breath, my legs aching, but I didn't care. I was safe. Or so I thought. I left the woods that day, but the feeling never left me. The sound of footsteps still echoed in my mind, the whisper still lingered in my ears, and when I looked into the rearview mirror of my car, I swear I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me drive away. I don't know what it was that I encountered in those woods. I don't know who or what was following me, but I'll never go back. The woods have their secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had never been one to shy away from solitude. In fact, I often craved it. The thought of being deep in the woods, far away from civilization, with nothing but the sounds of nature and the rustling of leaves in the wind, felt like a form of therapy to me. That's why, when the opportunity arose for me to rent a cabin in a remote part of the Adirondacks for a week, I jumped at the chance. I had been working nonstop for months, and the idea of disconnecting completely, no phone, no internet, no noise, was exactly what I needed. The cabin I rented was isolated, nestled deep in the forest, accessible only by a dirt road that was often impassable during the rainy season. I didn't mind. I liked the idea of truly being alone, free from the distractions of daily life. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described, small, cozy, and surrounded by towering trees. The owner, an elderly woman named Rose, had warned me that the area could feel unnerving at times, especially in the evenings when the wind would pick up and the forest came alive with strange sounds. I brushed it off as her trying to scare me, maybe to add some character to the place. I was used to the woods. I'd spent a lot of time hiking and camping throughout my life. The first 2 days passed in peaceful solitude. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, reading, and taking long walks by the lake. The weather was perfect, cool, with just enough sun to keep things comfortable, and no sign of any rain in sight. The only sounds that surrounded me were the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush and the chirping of birds overhead. But on the third day, things started to feel different. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to take a longer walk into the woods. I had ventured out to a trail I hadn't yet explored, one that went deeper into the forest. The trees were denser here, their thick branches casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots against the dry leaves and the occasional distant bird call. I wasn't paying much attention to time, lost in the peace of the woods, when I realized that the sun was beginning to set. I still had a good distance to cover to get back to the cabin, and although the trail was familiar, it would be difficult to navigate in the dark. Reluctantly, I turned around and started heading back the way I had come. That's when I heard it. At first, it was a faint sound, something almost imperceptible, a rustling like something was moving through the underbrush, just off the trail. I paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just an animal. But then it came again, closer this time. The noise was unmistakable. It was the sound of something walking, its steps deliberate, as though it was following me. My heart began to race. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining my ears to catch any movement. But the forest was silent, save for the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. I couldn't see anything, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods, and the quiet can play tricks on you. I shook my head and continued on, trying to push the feeling away. But no matter how fast I walked, the rustling continued, always just behind me. I started to quicken my pace, then break into a jog, the sound of footsteps growing louder and closer with every passing moment. My breathing became erratic, and panic crept up my spine. I was being followed. There was no other explanation. I had to get back to the cabin, and fast. I reached a clearing and was momentarily relieved to see the trail leading back to the cabin. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burn in my legs, the panic that was making it hard to breathe. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just kept running, hoping that whatever was behind me would disappear when I reached the safety of the cabin. As I neared the clearing that led to the cabin, I took one last glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The forest was still. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and slowed to a walk. The feeling of being followed still lingered, but at least now I was close to home. I reached the cabin, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the door to get inside. Once the door was shut and locked, I leaned against it, my heart still pounding in my chest. I spent the evening trying to calm down. I had been spooked. Sure, it was probably just an animal. Maybe a deer or a bear had been tracking me from a distance. I made myself dinner, read a book, and tried to relax by the fire. But as the night wore on, something kept nagging at me. I kept thinking about the footsteps, about how deliberate they had been, how they had matched my pace, how they had never faltered. It didn't make sense. It wasn't like any animal I had ever encountered. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made me jump. I kept checking the door to make sure it was locked, even though I knew no one could have gotten in without me hearing it. I finally fell asleep around midnight, but it was a restless sleep, filled with strange dreams. I dreamt of the woods, of dark shapes moving between the trees, of whispering voices that seemed to call my name. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, heart racing, unsure whether I had been dreaming or if something had actually been in the cabin with me. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted, as though I hadn't slept at all. But the sun was shining, and the day was clear. I decided I needed to shake off the fear from the night before. I went outside, took a deep breath of the fresh air, and tried to push the anxiety aside. The woods were still beautiful, and I couldn't let one strange experience ruin my time there. I decided to take another walk, this time staying closer to the cabin. I followed the trail along the edge of the property, trying to enjoy the peaceful surroundings. But as I walked, I began to feel that familiar sense of unease creeping back in. The same feeling I had experienced yesterday, like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind me. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. I continued walking, trying to shake the feeling, but the unease grew stronger. And then I saw it. Just off the trail, partially hidden behind a tree, was a figure. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a shadow, a dark shape that seemed to blend in with the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped out from behind the tree and into the clearing, just enough for me to see its form. I froze. It wasn't a person, but it was humanoid in shape. Tall, gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long and thin. Its face was obscured, hidden by a hood or something else, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just stood there, staring at the thing. And then it turned and disappeared into the woods, like it had never been there at all. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to flee the woods, and never look back, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, until the sounds of the forest returned to normal, just birds and wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. But I knew deep down that something was wrong. Something was out there in those woods, and it wasn't going to let me leave. That afternoon, I packed my things and left the cabin. I didn't care about the money I'd spent or the days I had planned to stay. I didn't care about anything except getting out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back. When I reached the road, I waited for a car to pass. I don't know what I thought might happen, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. And when I finally caught a ride into town, I never spoke of the experience to anyone. It felt too strange, too impossible. But I knew what I had seen. I still have nightmares about that day, about the figure in the woods. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know it's still out there. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I've always been the type of person who needed time alone. Crowds drained me, the constant noise of city life felt like a constant weight on my chest, and I often found solace in the wilderness, where I could escape and clear my mind. It wasn't unusual for me to take a solo camping trip, and when I found a remote patch of forest that seemed perfect for a getaway, I was eager to spend a few days there, completely isolated. The forest was deep, nestled between the foothills of a mountain range, far off from any popular hiking trails or established campsites. No one else seemed to visit, and that's just the way I liked it. The quiet, the isolation. It felt almost sacred to me, like I could be alone with my thoughts without interruption. I arrived at the forest entrance late in the afternoon, the sun just starting to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine, and I could hear the distant rush of water from a creek somewhere in the distance. I had a vague idea of where I wanted to set up camp, about 5 miles into the woods, near the creek where I could fish if I needed to. I packed light, knowing I'd only be gone for a couple of nights, and began my hike. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had my map and compass, and I'd studied the route beforehand. The further I went into the woods, the more isolated I became. The trail was less of a clear path and more of a suggestion, but I dealt with worse before. The air grew cooler as the sun set, and soon I was hiking in twilight, the shadows of the trees long and deep. By the time I reached the clearing by the creek, it was fully dark. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but the stars above were brilliant, and the air was refreshing. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some firewood, and started a fire. As the fire crackled, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I had always been comfortable in the wilderness. It was my element, a place where I could truly be myself. I had no plans to be social, no obligations to anyone. Just me, the fire, and the forest. I ate my dinner by the fire, quietly watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the forest. There was something peaceful about it all, something that calmed the mind. But after a while, the peacefulness of the night began to feel strange, almost unnerving. I had expected to hear animals, squirrels, owls, maybe the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush, but there was nothing, not a single chirp or hoot or rustling leaf, only the crackle of the fire and the occasional pop as a log shifted in the flames. I shook off the feeling. It wasn't unusual for forests to be quiet at night, I told myself. Maybe it was just a lull in the natural sounds. I settled back against a log and relaxed, watching the fire, but that's when I started to hear something else. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but then it became clearer. Footsteps. At first I thought it might be an animal, but the rhythm was all wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate. Someone or something was walking through the forest, and the sound was coming closer. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow, heavy, and the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath them was unmistakable. They were definitely human footsteps. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I had done my research before coming here, and I knew the area was remote. It was the type of place where people didn't wander into by accident. The closest town was miles away, and no one else was supposed to be in these woods. The footsteps stopped abruptly. A cold knot of fear twisted in my stomach. I didn't dare move. The sound of the footsteps had come from the direction of the trees, but now there was nothing. Just silence. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire, waiting. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just someone else hiking in the woods, or maybe a ranger. But the longer I sat in the quiet, the more I doubted that. There was something unsettling about the stillness that followed those footsteps, like the air itself had grown heavier. I glanced around, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing. Just the dense shadows of the woods stretching back into the darkness. I didn't know what to do. I told myself to calm down, that I was just imagining things. It was probably just an animal, maybe a bear or a large deer, but it didn't feel like that. It felt wrong, like someone or something was out there watching me. I grabbed my knife from my bag, just in case, though I couldn't explain why I thought I'd need it. I stayed by the fire for the rest of the night, constantly looking over my shoulder, straining to hear anything. The footsteps didn't return, but the silence was more oppressive now than before. It felt like the forest had swallowed every other sound, leaving me alone with my fear. Around midnight, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I decided to pack up and leave. Maybe it was just nerves, but I felt like I needed to get out of the woods, away from whatever was out there. I doused the fire, packed my things as quickly as I could, and started back down the trail. The night was dark, and the only light was from my flashlight. The trees loomed tall on either side, casting long shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that everything was fine, but every step I took felt like it was carrying me deeper into something I couldn't quite understand. As I walked, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, moving through the forest just behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickened my pace. The footsteps followed, keeping time with my hurried steps. I started to run, but it didn't help. The footsteps were still there, always just behind me, too close for comfort. I could hear them, could feel the weight of the presence behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the empty, dark woods. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, my breath ragged and my legs aching. I didn't look back. I threw my gear into the car, slammed the door, and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to stop until I was far out of the woods. I didn't stop to think about what had happened, or to try to explain it. I didn't know what had followed me in those woods, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. The next morning, I called the ranger station to report what had happened. They assured me no one else had been out there and that I was the only hiker they knew of in the area. They didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. I don't care how peaceful or beautiful they are. Whatever was out there, whatever followed me that night, I don't ever want to know what it was. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend in the woods, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The plan was simple, a solo camping trip to decompress from everything going on in my life. Work had been overwhelming, and I'd needed some space to clear my head. No distractions, no noise, just the natural world. I had been camping alone before, and I had never had any issues, so I didn't think twice when I decided to head out to a remote area about 2 hours north of the city. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. The weather was cool, but not too cold, perfect for an autumn getaway. The sun was beginning to dip behind the tree line as I pulled my gear from the back of my truck and strapped on my backpack. I was already familiar with the area, a well-known forest preserve that offered solitude for anyone willing to brave the often overgrown trails. It was far enough off the beaten path to avoid heavy foot traffic, but not so isolated that I felt completely unsafe. The hike wasn't too difficult. about 3 miles through dense woods to a secluded campsite by a small creek. I'd camped here before, but it had been several years, and the place had always held a certain peace for me. The sound of the water, the rustling of the leaves in the wind, and the distant bird calls. It was the kind of place where I could think, away from the noise of the world. I set up my tent in the fading light, gathered some dry wood for the fire, and made myself a simple dinner of freeze-dried camping meals. As night settled in, the darkness felt complete, and I couldn't help but feel a bit more isolated than usual. The night creatures came alive around me, owls hooting in the distance, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But there was nothing alarming about it, just the typical sounds of the forest at night. I sat by the fire for a while, drinking hot tea and staring into the flames. The flickering light seemed to ease my mind, and I thought about the quietness of this place. I'd always loved the idea of being alone in nature, of finding peace in the silence. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt the weight of isolation. It wasn't a fear of being alone. It was more of a discomfort, like I was hyper-aware of the absence of everything else. Eventually, I turned in for the night. The air had grown colder, and I climbed into my sleeping bag, pulling the hood of my jacket over my head. I lay there, listening to the sound of the fire crackling outside. I could still see the orange glow of it through the fabric of my tent, but it was fading. I closed my eyes, trying to get comfortable, when something caught my attention. A noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind. Maybe a branch had shifted or fallen, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone or something was walking through the woods near my campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps weren't close, but they were definitely moving in my direction. It wasn't an animal. This was too heavy, too rhythmic. Someone was walking on two legs, taking deliberate steps through the underbrush. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I stopped myself. Whoever it was, they might be too close already. Instead, I lay still, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. It sounded like whoever it was circling my camp. I could hear them walking around the perimeter, stepping carefully through the underbrush. Never too close, but never too far away either. I thought about calling out, but something inside me told me not to. I wasn't sure why, but I had a bad feeling about it. Time passed and the footsteps seemed to move farther away, but I didn't dare move. The forest outside my tent was eerily silent now, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making every small sound feel amplified. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a hiker, someone else camping nearby, but the thought of someone being so close without my noticing sent a chill down my spine. Eventually, the footsteps stopped altogether. The silence returned, heavy and still. I waited for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself it had all been some figment of my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, too worn out from the hike. I tried to close my eyes again, but sleep wouldn't come. I just lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep well. Every little noise, every shift in the wind, made me jump. My mind wouldn't quiet. I kept imagining the figure moving around my tent, peering in through the mesh windows, watching me. But when morning came, everything seemed calm again. The sun was just rising, and the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool morning air, stretching and trying to shake off the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of my stomach. The forest was quiet, still, as though nothing had happened during the night. I checked my campsite. My backpack was exactly where I had left it, the fire pit still cold and empty. The forest around me was peaceful, the only sounds coming from the distant creek and the birds that were beginning to stir. I told myself I had been paranoid, imagining things in the dark. It happens. I spent the morning hiking around the area, taking in the natural beauty of the place. The weather was perfect, sunny but cool, with the leaves starting to turn vibrant shades of red and orange. It was exactly what I needed, a day to clear my mind, to think things through without the constant rush of daily life. But as the day wore on, that strange sense of discomfort began to creep back in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching me. Every rustle in the leaves, every shift in the wind made me pause, looking over my shoulder. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was still a little jumpy from last night, but the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. By late afternoon, I decided to pack up and head back to my truck. The hike back was uneventful, but my senses were on high alert the entire time. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the forest. My mind kept racing, replaying the footsteps I had heard the night before. Who was out there, and why were they so close? When I reached my truck and loaded my gear back into the bed, I took a final look at the forest. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows long in the fading light. But there was something unsettling about it now, a sense that the woods weren't as peaceful as I had once thought. As I drove away, the woods seemed to recede into the distance behind me, but that feeling, that sense of being watched, never fully left. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of that night. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm certain I wasn't alone. I don't go camping alone anymore. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
I had always loved the idea of escaping from the hustle and bustle of daily life, and what better way to do that than to rent a secluded cabin deep in the woods for a few days. I had booked a small rustic cabin located in the Appalachian Mountains, miles away from any kind of town or city. The plan was simple: unplug, disconnect, and find peace in the silence of nature. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just me and the trees. It was a 3-hour drive from my home to the cabin. I'd chosen this place because it promised complete isolation, a trait that appealed to me. I didn't mind being alone. Actually, I preferred it. It was the perfect retreat for someone who had been overwhelmed with work and needed to recharge. When I arrived, the place was everything I had hoped for. The cabin was tucked away in a dense thicket of trees with a small stream running nearby. The air smelled fresh and clean, like pine and damp earth. It was peaceful, serene, and I couldn't wait to spend the next few days exploring the surrounding woods and simply enjoying the solitude. I unpacked my things, settled into the cozy cabin, and spent the first evening on the porch, watching the sunset through the trees. As darkness descended, the night felt thick and heavy, but the air was crisp. The kind of quiet that envelops you when you're miles from civilization began to settle in, and I felt the kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. That night, I slept soundly for a few hours, but I woke up around 2 a.m. At first, I couldn't tell what had disturbed my sleep, but as I lay in the stillness of the cabin, I heard something faint. A sound, a thud, then a rustling, followed by the snap of a twig. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to beat faster. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A deer? A deer? I had read about wildlife in the area, so it was possible. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and shone it out the window, but all I saw was darkness, just the shadows of trees and the dim moonlight. Nothing was there. I laid back down, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. Nothing to be afraid of. But sleep didn't come easily after that. Every small creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me tense, my mind continuing to race. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. The air was cool and crisp, with a light fog lingering in the trees. I made my way down a trail that seemed to wind deeper into the forest, the path lined with thick woods and towering pines. I hadn't planned out a specific route, but I figured I'd let my curiosity guide me. The further I went, the quieter the forest seemed to get. The usual sounds of birds and insects were muted, as though the trees were holding their breath. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling that was beginning to settle in, but the silence was oppressive. I stopped by a small clearing, taking in the scenery. The fog had started to lift, revealing the full depth of the woods. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, their branches twisting and curling in strange, unnatural ways. I stood there for a while, mesmerized by the beauty of it all. That's when I heard it again. The same noise from last night, the thud followed by the rustling, the snap of a twig. It was closer this time. My heart rate quickened, and I turned around, scanning the trees around me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel that sense of being watched, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I stood frozen for a moment, then decided to head back to the cabin. The woods were getting thicker, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. My steps quickened as I retraced my path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I stopped several times to listen, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the rustling of leaves beneath my feet. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the unease didn't go away. I tried to distract myself with books, music, and even cooking, but nothing seemed to work. The feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sounds again. This time, it wasn't just one sound, it was multiple. Footsteps, the snap of branches, something moving through the woods, circling the cabin. I lay perfectly still, my mind racing. I had read about hikers disappearing in the woods, about strange noises in isolated areas, but never thought I would be on the receiving end of such a situation. The sounds came closer and closer, and then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried out of bed. My pulse was racing, and my legs felt weak beneath me. I stood by the window, shining the beam of light into the surrounding forest. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something move. A figure, tall, thin, with its back to me, standing in the shadows just beyond the tree line. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting, watching. My heart stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to look away. I thought I was imagining things, that I was just sleep-deprived, but the figure remained, a dark silhouette against the trees. Then, without warning, it disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stumbled back from the window, my hands shaking. I couldn't stay here any longer. The calm, peaceful retreat I had been hoping for had turned into a nightmare. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone, or something, was out there. The next morning, I packed my things in a frenzy. I didn't even care to make sure I had everything, just the essentials: clothes, keys, wallet. I didn't want to stay another night, let alone another hour. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal so I could call for help, but there was nothing. No bars, no Wi-Fi. I was completely cut off. I had no choice but to leave the cabin and drive back to civilization. As I started the car and pulled out of the driveway, I glanced one last time at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The figure was there, standing in the window, watching. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 11.
I had always loved hiking, but it wasn't until recently that I decided to go on a solo trip in the woods. My friends and family warned me about going alone, but I didn't see the problem. I'd been hiking plenty of times before with groups, and I thought I could handle being by myself for a change. Besides, I wanted peace, the kind of peace you can only find in the stillness of the forest. The trail I chose was an old, less traveled one in the Appalachian Mountains. It was known for its seclusion, and I liked the idea of being away from the noise of civilization. I had checked the weather. It was supposed to be clear for the next few days, and packed light, just my essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a few days' worth of food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty map. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. The sun was shining, the air crisp and refreshing, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth. It was everything I had imagined: silent, peaceful, untouched by human presence. The only sound was the crunch of my boots against the dirt trail. The first few hours were uneventful. I hiked steadily, taking breaks now and then to drink some water or enjoy the quiet. The trail began to narrow as I got deeper into the woods, and the trees grew taller, their branches reaching over the path like skeletal hands. The silence became more profound, and it wasn't long before the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. By the time evening came, I reached the spot I'd planned to camp for the night, an open area by a small creek surrounded by thick trees. It felt isolated, but in a comforting way. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made a simple meal of trail mix and water. The fire crackled as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. As night fell, the temperature dropped and the wind began to pick up. It wasn't anything too alarming, just the usual chill of the woods at night. I settled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to relax. The sounds of the forest at night were different, more alive, almost as if the woods themselves were whispering to each other. But as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft rustling coming from just outside my tent. I brushed it off as the wind or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it came again, a distinct rustling followed by a slight tapping, as if something was tapping on the fabric of the tent. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just a curious animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the noise didn't stop. It continued for what felt like an eternity, and I could feel my breath quicken, my senses sharpening. I had heard of animals being curious about campsites, but this felt different. The tapping had a rhythm to it, as if whatever was out there was deliberately trying to get my attention. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the tent fabric. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing outside. The rustling stopped almost immediately after I turned the light on. My mind started racing. Had I imagined it? Was I just being paranoid? But the sound had been so real, so close. I waited for a few minutes, listening intently. The forest had fallen quiet again. My pulse began to slow, and I convinced myself to calm down. It was probably nothing. I could get some sleep now. But then I heard it again. This time it wasn't just a rustle. It was louder and much closer. The unmistakable sound of something scraping against the tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew something wasn't right. I waited a little longer, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. It was quiet for a moment, and then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching softly in the leaves. The footsteps circled my campsite, moving steadily, just out of sight. Whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was, and it wasn't just passing through. I lay frozen, hardly daring to breathe. My thoughts raced. Was it someone else on the trail? A hiker who had gotten lost? But no, I had seen no one all day. There had been no other vehicles at the trailhead. Whoever was out there had to be someone who had been watching me. I grabbed my knife, my only weapon, and quietly unzipped the tent. I poked my head out just enough to see, but there was nothing. No one. The moonlight shone down on the empty clearing, the creek gently flowing beside me. I was about to slip back into my tent when I heard a sound, faint like a whisper on the wind. It was a voice, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. My skin prickled, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of the woods. But I couldn't, at least not yet. I decided to leave my flashlight on, hoping it would make me feel safer. I lay back down in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all, but the feeling of being watched never left. My heart was still pounding, and every little noise made me jump. Around 2 a.m., the rustling outside began again. This time, it was different. It was slow, almost deliberate, as if someone was circling my tent, waiting for me to make a sound. The whispering was still there, but now it sounded like more than one voice, overlapping and indistinct, like a dozen people murmuring in some unknown language. I knew I had to get out of there. The forest, once peaceful and serene, now felt like a trap. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, trying to be as quiet as possible. But the moment I zipped up my bag, I heard a loud snap, like a twig breaking, right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the trees, the darkness, and the chilling wind that whipped through the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was just out of sight, watching me. I grabbed my things and began to make my way down the trail, my heart racing with every step. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy, and the darkness around me seemed to grow thicker as I walked deeper into the woods. The further I went, the more the whispering seemed to follow me, growing louder, as if it were just behind me, right on the edge of my hearing. I didn't stop walking, not once. My legs were aching, my breath ragged, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a primal instinct telling me to run, to get out, to escape whatever was out there. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was just starting to rise. I could see the outline of my car in the parking lot, and it felt like a beacon of safety. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to see if anything was following me. I just threw my gear in the car and drove, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I never went back to those woods. I never told anyone about what happened that night, and I don't think I ever will. Some things are too terrifying to put into words. All I know is that something was out there, and I'm not sure if it was human or something else. But I know one thing for sure: the woods are not always peaceful. Story the end.